A quiet town, a vanished name, and a secret buried beneath ivy and silence. Some stories aren't lost, just waiting to be heard. Tonight, truth finds its way through torn letters, faded photographs, and the garden no one dares speak of. So tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The love letter that started it all. The train pulled into Maplebridge Station with a gentle sigh of brakes and steam, and Jessica Fletcher stepped onto the platform with the familiar blend of anticipation and quiet nostalgia she often felt when returning to a place once dear to her. Maplebridge was smaller than she remembered, but not diminished. Its charm had simply weathered itself into a kind of permanent grace. Ivy still curled over the iron railings near the station's entrance, and the scent of lilacs drifted from somewhere unseen. She had been invited back to speak at the annual Maplebridge Literary Festival, held this year in honor of the late poet Thomas Averill. The request had come from Rebecca Averill, Thomas's only daughter, and once Jessica's eager young student during a summer writing seminar nearly 30 years ago. Jessica had accepted with genuine warmth. She remembered Rebecca fondly, bright, passionate, and often carrying a leather-bound journal with pages so filled with notes they threatened to burst. Now, as Jessica crossed the cobbled road to where Rebecca stood waiting near a green town car, she saw traces of that girl still flickering behind the eyes of the grown woman. "Jessica," Rebecca greeted her, arms open in a hesitant hug. "I can't tell you how much this means to us." Jessica returned the embrace gently. "It's good to be back, Rebecca, though I wish the occasion weren't quite so bittersweet." Rebecca's smile faltered for the briefest second. "Yes, it's been a hard few months." As they drove through town toward the inn, Jessica took in the familiar sights, the steepled church, the whitewashed bookstore, and the gentle sloping hills that cradled Maplebridge like a secret. Yet even in this pastoral serenity, there was something slightly out of tune. The shutters on several houses were drawn, despite the pleasant weather, and a few passers-by looked away as their car rolled past. She turned to Rebecca. "And how has the town been adjusting?" Rebecca hesitated. "Well, people say they're grieving, but grief in Maplebridge, it doesn't always look like sorrow. Sometimes it looks like silence." Jessica nodded slowly. Silence had its own dialect, especially in small towns where memory walked as freely as the living. The Honeycroft Inn stood as gracefully as it had when Jessica last visited, all white trim, lace curtains and polished wood. Yet when she stepped into the front parlor, she noticed the shift immediately. The warmth was still there, but tempered, like tea left to cool. Mrs. Ellison, the innkeeper, offered a polite welcome. Her smile barely creased the corners of her eyes. "We've put you in the Rose Suite, Mrs. Fletcher," she said, leading Jessica up the staircase with a careful tread. "Same one as your last visit, if I recall." Jessica nodded appreciatively. "That was the summer of '91, I believe." "Oh yes," Mrs. Ellison replied. "The year the festival had that rainstorm, we nearly lost the poetry tent." But her voice grew quieter as they reached the top landing. "Much has changed since then." Jessica didn't press, but as she unpacked in the quiet room overlooking the garden, she noticed a framed photograph on the desk. Thomas Averill stood beside a woman with soft features and auburn hair, her face faintly scratched, as though time itself had tried to erase her. No name, no date. Downstairs, she passed a cluster of locals in hushed conversation. Their murmurs stopped when they saw her, replaced by the thinnest of smiles. Friendly, but guarded, Jessica offered a polite nod and stepped outside, letting the crisp autumn air settle over her. Already, the story had begun to whisper to her, not in words, but in glances, gestures, the unspoken tension that hung over Maplebridge like the veil of morning fog. She'd come to speak of poetry and memory, but something told her that the real story here was still unfolding, and perhaps had never truly ended. Jessica lingered a moment longer in the quiet parlor of the Honeycroft Inn. Afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, catching dust in the air like drifting memories. Her eyes drifted again to the framed photograph on the credenza, the same one she had glimpsed earlier. Drawn by an odd sense of familiarity, she stepped closer. It was unmistakably Thomas Averill, perhaps in his late 30s. He stood beside a woman, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back, the kind of closeness that didn't require work. Yet the woman's face had been partially, deliberately, scratched out, not the careless tear of time, but something sharper, more intentional, as though someone wanted to keep the memory but erase the identity. Jessica studied the remaining details: auburn hair pulled into a soft chignon, a necklace with a simple silver pendant, the faint suggestion of a half-smile. The backdrop appeared to be the Averill family garden. She recognized the wrought-iron bench, now moss-covered and sagging from years of weather. Mrs. Ellison returned from the back room with a tray of lemon tea and 2 cups, her expression neutral. "I don't mean to pry," Jessica began gently, still looking at the photograph, "but do you know who the woman is with Thomas in this picture?" The innkeeper hesitated. "That one's been here longer than I have. It came from the Averills themselves, long ago. Guests don't usually ask." Jessica offered a polite smile, but her mind stirred with quiet unease. People often asked about photographs, unless they'd been taught not to. As she sipped the tea, warm and tart on her tongue, Jessica filed the mud away. Not a clue just yet, but a wrinkle in the fabric, and in Maplebridge, such wrinkles never lay flat for long. Later that afternoon, Jessica visited the Averill home, a gracious old colonial wrapped in vines and shaded by a canopy of oak. Rebecca had offered her use of the study to prepare her remarks for the festival, an honor Jessica accepted with quiet gratitude. The room bore the weight of a writer's life. Shelves sagged with poetry volumes, most bearing Thomas Averill's name in gold-embossed lettering. A fountain pen rested in a porcelain holder. Yellowed drafts, marked in the poet's angular hand, spilled from a leather portfolio on the desk. Jessica took a seat near the window and opened a worn notebook. She had barely begun to jot down a few thoughts when her gaze caught a crooked book on the top shelf. Echoes in Fog, a lesser-known volume of Thomas's early work. She reached for it, only to find it wedged tightly. As she eased it free, something slipped from behind it and fluttered to the floor. It was an envelope. Unmarked, unsealed. The paper yellowed and soft with age. Jessica hesitated. Then, curiosity tempered by caution, she unfolded the single sheet inside. The handwriting was delicate, looping, feminine. "My dearest Thomas, I watched you from across the room last night, and it was as though I had never known you at all. You wear distance like armor now. I understand, but when you walk past me, I still remember the warmth of your hand on my back that spring, and the way you once said my poems tasted of late summer rain. I have kept your secret. I always will, but the truth we shared cannot be buried under reputation. You are more than your name. I loved you. I still do." Jessica read the letter twice, then folded it gently, her brow furrowed in thought. There was no date, no address, but the tone, intimate, unresolved, suggested more than a fleeting encounter. This wasn't youthful infatuation. It was the kind of love that doesn't fit neatly inside a life already lived. She looked around the study again. No sign of this in any of the books, acknowledgments, or photos on the desk. Just Thomas, again and again, captured alone, or with Rebecca. Jessica slipped the letter into her notebook, not to steal it, but to keep it safe, for now. The house breathed softly around her, still echoing its absent master. She didn't yet know who E was, but she had the feeling that this letter, long hidden, was not meant to remain so. Secrets, in Jessica's experience, were like seeds. Buried long enough, they eventually forced their way to the surface, and something told her this one had just begun to break the soil. Jessica sat in the Averill study, the letter folded neatly in her lap. The fire in the hearth crackled low, giving off just enough warmth to soften the edge of early evening chill. She had read the letter 3 times now, and its voice lingered, haunting and unfinished. There was no doubt in her mind. This was not the sort of correspondence exchanged between casual acquaintances. It had the quiet ache of something once beautiful, now hidden beneath layers of time and restraint. Whoever E was, she had loved Thomas Averill deeply, perhaps even destructively. Jessica's fingers traced the edge of the paper, brittle at the fold. A line had caught her each time. "I have kept your secret, I always will." It wasn't simply a love letter, it was a pact. She rose slowly, placing the letter back in her notebook, and scanning the room again. There were no framed photographs of anyone resembling the woman from the inn's scratched picture, no dedications to a muse in Thomas's published works. Whoever E had been, she had been carefully, even deliberately, erased. And yet, there was no denying her presence now. That letter was never meant to be found, and yet it had slipped loose, almost as if it had waited long enough. Jessica glanced out the tall window toward the garden. Twilight deepened across the hedges and ivy-wrapped statues. Somewhere in that hush, she felt the beginning of something unraveling. Thomas Averill had left behind poetry, honors, and a carefully shaped memory of himself. But love, Jessica thought, has a way of surviving even the neatest legacies, and secrets, the kind woven into the corners of lives, have a habit of blooming, no matter how deep they're buried. She closed the study door softly behind her. The evening air carried a slight bite as Jessica stepped onto the Averill lawn, intending only a short walk before supper. The wind rustled the trees with a brittle whisper, and lights flickered faintly in the windows of the nearby homes. Somewhere distant, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Then came the sirens. A pair of red lights pulsed against the hedgerows just beyond the curve of the garden. Jessica's pace quickened. As she reached the back gate of the Averill property, she saw a patrol car parked at the edge of the gravel path. Uniformed officers stood just beyond it, their expressions drawn. An ambulance idled nearby, its engine rumbling low like an uneasy sigh. Rebecca stood near the center of the garden, her arms folded tightly around herself, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the rose arbor. Jessica's heart sank even before she reached her side. "It's Daniel," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. Jessica followed her gaze. Daniel Reese, Rebecca's fiancé, lay on the ground near the old sundial, his body still, one arm askew. The marble dial itself was stained along one edge, cracked slightly at the base. Blood had pooled into the stonework beneath him. A medic stood back, shaking his head. Sheriff Clara Duval, a broad-shouldered woman with silvering hair and a furrowed brow, turned toward Jessica. "Mrs. Fletcher," she greeted. "Not unkindly, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." Jessica inclined her head. "So do I. What happened?" she asked gently, though the ache in Rebecca's face already told much of the story. "We were at the library this afternoon," Rebecca said, barely above a whisper. "Daniel said he needed to go back to the house, something about looking through the garden before dark. I didn't think anything of it. He said he'd meet me for dinner. He never came." Jessica looked again at the sundial, cracked, not shattered. The angle of Daniel's fall didn't suggest a struggle, nor did it seem like an accident. There was intention in the way he was lying, just slightly turned from the path. Sheriff Duval knelt beside the body and examined something in Daniel's coat. She straightened, holding a torn piece of paper between two fingers. "Odd thing," she said. "Looks like part of an old letter. No envelope." Jessica took a quiet step closer, already sensing what she would see. The familiar looping script. A fragment of a phrase, "cannot be buried under reputation." Her breath caught. That letter had not remained hidden after all. Jessica sat beside Rebecca on the stone bench that curved around the garden's outer edge. The moonlight traced pale lines over the lawn, silvering the broken sundial. "I don't understand," Rebecca murmured. "He never mentioned that letter. I swear I never saw it." Jessica believed her. The grief in Rebecca's voice was too raw, too unguarded. And yet, Daniel had clearly found the letter, or part of it, after Jessica had left the study. Unless, of course, he hadn't found it. Unless it had been given to him. Jessica turned the thought over silently. Daniel, the gentle schoolteacher, always polite, always observant. She recalled a conversation from the previous year when she had seen him at a teaching conference in Boston. He had mentioned being fascinated by literary ethics, the blurred lines between fiction and autobiography. Could he have come across something in Thomas's work that hinted at this hidden affair? And if he had, what had he planned to do with it? The presence of the torn letter in his pocket spoke of intent. It wasn't just a curiosity, it was something he carried with purpose. Jessica suspected he had begun asking questions. Questions someone may not have wanted answered. She looked back at the cracked sundial. Its shadow fell across the very place where Daniel's body had lain. A timekeeper, Jessica thought, and perhaps now, a tombstone. Sheriff Duval stood near the path, conferring quietly with one of her deputies. Jessica waited until the moment felt right. "Do you believe it was a break-in?" she asked. The sheriff's brow creased. There was no sign of forced entry, but someone could have come through the garden gate. "It's not locked." Jessica nodded. "And yet, there's something too personal about it. Almost as if Daniel was meant to be found." Sheriff Duval considered that. He was struck once. Clean. Someone knew what they were doing. Jessica's thoughts returned to the letter. Both halves now accounted for, but the truth still maddeningly incomplete. The wound that had opened in this garden had nothing to do with theft. This felt like fear, fear that something long buried might come to light. She looked up toward the Averill house, its windows dark, its shutters closed. A secret lived there once. And perhaps, Jessica thought, it still did. Jessica remained in the garden long after the ambulance had departed, her thoughts circling like dry leaves in the wind. Rebecca stood a few steps away beneath the darkened arbor, her hands clasped in front of her as if holding something fragile. "I didn't kill him, Jessica," she said finally, her voice barely more than a breath. "But I know people are starting to wonder." Jessica moved beside her gently, her presence calm but grounded. "Of course you didn't," she said. "But I think someone was afraid of what Daniel knew." Rebecca blinked hard. He was gentle, quiet even, but curious. He asked questions about my father, about his early work. I didn't think anything of it. It all seemed academic. Jessica's gaze moved toward the broken sundial. "Curiosity isn't dangerous in itself," she murmured. "But it can be if it threatens a story that someone spent years trying to control." Rebecca looked at her sharply. "You mean the letter?" Jessica didn't reply, but the silence between them confirmed the answer. Rebecca swallowed. "Will you help me?" "Not just because I'm your former student, but because I don't know who else to trust right now." Jessica laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly why I'm here." And silently Jessica added to herself, not to prove innocence or guilt, but to follow the path the truth had already begun carving, one word at a time. The next morning Jessica walked to the Maplebridge Public Library under a low grey sky that hinted at rain. The red brick building stood just off the town square, dignified yet unassuming, much like the people who ran it. Sylvie Maris, the town historian, was shelving a stack of monographs when Jessica entered. She was a woman of middle age with sharp cheekbones and neatly parted grey-streaked hair, her eyes quick behind reading glasses. Her manner, always polite, stiffened just slightly at the sight of Jessica. "I heard you were back," Sylvie said, her voice neutral. "I'm sorry your visit has been overshadowed." "I'm sorry as well," Jessica replied gently, "especially for Daniel." Sylvie gave a brief nod, but said nothing more. "I understand he came here recently," Jessica continued. "Spent quite a bit of time in the archives." "He did," Sylvie confirmed, her tone clipped. "He said he was working on a side project, some kind of genealogical thread he wanted to trace. I told him that wasn't part of the public-facing festival materials." Jessica caught the defensive phrasing. "Not festival records but town records." "Did you argue?" Sylvie hesitated, then drew in a breath. "He was insistent. He said something in one of our published volumes didn't add up, that a page from the town's 1980 register had been removed or edited. I told him he must be mistaken." "But he wasn't, was he?" Jessica asked, watching her carefully. Sylvie lowered her gaze. "Some things were redacted, years ago, at someone's request." "Who?" Sylvie's voice barely carried. "Margaret Averill." Jessica paused. "Margaret, Thomas's late wife. The keeper of the family name and perhaps its silences. It wasn't proof, but it was pressure. The kind of pressure that suggested Daniel had pressed too hard." Back at the Averill house, Jessica asked Rebecca if she might spend another moment in the study. Rebecca agreed without question, though her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. The study was just as Jessica had left it, quiet, composed, almost reverent. But as she moved among the shelves again, her attention shifted not to the books of poetry, but to a leather folio tucked beneath a stack of letters on the far desk. It bore Thomas Averill's initials, but no title. She opened it carefully. Inside were pages, not yet typeset, of what appeared to be a memoir, written in Thomas's distinct hand. The tone was reflective, poetic in its way, though stripped of the flourish his public work often bore. And yet, Jessica's eye caught the repetition of a curious detail. A name, Eleanor, appeared once in early passages, and then conspicuously had been blacked out in later mentions, not just redacted, but neatly inked over, as if to maintain the flow of the sentence, while erasing the identity it once contained. Why leave the early reference, then? Jessica frowned, flipping through the next pages. More omissions, phrases like "the woman who changed the way I wrote," and "those letters I could never destroy," stood alone, cryptic, suggestive. Tucked between the last pages was a black and white photograph, half torn at the edge. Thomas, again, and beside him, the same woman from the inn's scratched photo, the same faint necklace. Her hand rested lightly on his forearm, but this time her face was whole. Jessica folded the memoir pages closed, the photograph gently atop them. She didn't take them, not yet, but the image burned clearly in her mind. Thomas Averill had loved a woman named Eleanor. He had written of her, spoken of her, and then with measured care removed her from the record, but not completely, and perhaps not willingly. Jessica stood still in the center of the study, aware now that every book on the shelf was only a version of the truth. The real story was beginning to surface, but not without resistance. Jessica's fingers lingered on the photograph she had found tucked behind the final pages of the censored memoir. The image, though aged, was unmistakably real. Thomas Averell seated on a garden bench, sunlight dappled across his lapel, and beside him, the same auburn-haired woman from the defaced portrait in the inn. But this time, her face was whole. She had a quiet beauty, unremarkable by worldly standards, but magnetic in its softness. Her hand rested not merely near Thomas's, but on it. There was no awkwardness in their pose, no effort to disguise the intimacy. Jessica noted the same pendant she had seen in the earlier photo, a silver teardrop shape, worn high against the woman's collarbone. She studied Thomas's expression too, not the public poet's composed gaze, but something gentler, almost unguarded. Jessica carefully placed the photo back into the drawer, but her mind turned over the implications. 2 photographs, in 2 different homes, from different periods, but the same woman erased, once by scratching, once by omission, not destroyed, merely hidden. Someone had tried to remove her from the record, but someone else, perhaps Thomas himself, had preserved this one fragment. Why hide her name in print, but hold on to the image in private? But the more Jessica learned about Eleanor, and she was now quite certain that was her name, the more she sensed she wasn't a footnote in Thomas Averell's life, but a chapter that had never been published, and perhaps for someone that was reason enough for silence. The next day, the town square buzzed with quiet speculation. The news of Daniel Reese's death, while still wrapped in euphemism, had spread with typical small-town efficiency. Jessica stopped by Langford and Sons Antiquarian Books, a narrow, musty store nestled between the cafe and the florist. Oliver Langford himself stood near the register, hunched slightly, a man aged not by time alone, but by the bitterness of being perpetually on the literary fringe. He spotted her instantly. "Ah, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, a note of theatrical gravity in his voice. "You've come to sift through the remains, have you?" Jessica tilted her head. "I'm hoping to understand them." Oliver gave a dry chuckle. "Understand this then. Thomas Averell was no saint. He built his career not just on words, but on carefully buried truths." Jessica remained quiet, letting him circle toward what he clearly wanted to say. "I saw that young man, Daniel, not 3 days ago. Came in asking if a scandal could invalidate a will." He leaned forward slightly. "He asked about literary property, about how reputations are curated. Did he mention Eleanor Pruitt?" Oliver's eyes glinted, not directly, but I told him, truth always seeps through the cracks. And if he was digging in the Averell archives, he was bound to uncover something Margaret spent years trying to whitewash. Jessica's mind clicked, not just a rival's bitterness. Oliver had known something, enough to recognize the shape of what Daniel might have been close to, and perhaps enough to make him dangerous. But Oliver wasn't hiding, he was boasting, and boasting, Jessica knew, was rarely a murderer's habit. It was a distraction, or a warning. Walking slowly back toward the inn, Jessica let the pieces rearrange themselves in her mind. Daniel had discovered the letter. He had spoken to Sylvie Maris about redacted records. He had questioned Oliver Langford about wills and scandal, and someone close to Thomas Averell's legacy, had felt the ground shifting beneath them. Jessica now saw the letter not only as a romantic relic, but as a potential threat to the Averell estate. If Thomas had fathered a child with Eleanor, and if that child still lived, it would complicate inheritance, and more importantly, rewrite Maplebridge's cherished narrative. Was that what Daniel had discovered? A living heir, a buried truth that undermined everything the Averill name stood for. And who, Jessica wondered, had the most to lose if that truth surfaced? She paused at the garden gate, letting her fingers graze the cold iron. The sundial stood just beyond, its face cracked, but still marking time, still casting shadows. Somewhere beneath those shadows, motive was growing, and it was no longer a question of if the truth would come out, but when, and at what cost. Jessica returned to the Maplebridge Library the following morning, drawn not just by curiosity, but by something subtler, an intuition that the story wasn't merely buried in private drawers and diaries, but perhaps lingered, quietly, in the public record. Back in the archives, she sifted through newspaper clippings, dusty alumni directories, and local event bulletins from the late 1970s and early 80s. She was searching not for something prominent, but for a faint echo, the kind of details small towns forget, until someone remembers to look again. It didn't take long. Tucked inside a poetry festival program from 1978 was a panel listing Thomas Averill guest speaker. Eleanor Pruitt, featured reader. Next to her name in fine print, local poet and instructor, Maplebridge High School. Jessica's brow furrowed. Pruitt. She searched further, now with purpose, and found a letter to the editor signed EP dated October 1979, expressing concern about changes to the town's curriculum. The writing was strong, direct, and quietly passionate, but after 1980, there was nothing. No mention in newsletters, yearbooks, festival rosters, no obituary, no marriage. Eleanor Pruitt had vanished, not just from the literary record, but from the town itself. Jessica sat back, letting the name settle into her thoughts like a puzzle piece that fits too perfectly. The phrasing in the letter she'd found, "I have kept your secret," took on new resonance. Not only a lover's confidence, but a disappearance, a silencing. Eleanor Pruitt hadn't merely left Maplebridge, she'd been edited out of it, but by whom, and why? Mildred Pruitt lived on the edge of town, in a modest white house shaded by two ancient elm trees. Jessica approached with measured steps, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. Some doors once knocked on, opened to far more than the person standing behind them. Mildred, a woman in her early 70s with a calm, cautious presence, greeted her with a raised brow and a simple, "You're here about Eleanor, aren't you?" Jessica inclined her head. "Yes, I'm trying to understand what happened." Mildred studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside and opened the door without another word. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Books lined the walls, some poetry, some gardening, all worn with age. They sat in the front room, tea between them, silence cushioning the space. "She left in the spring of 1980, Mildred began quietly. No dramatic goodbye. Just packed a suitcase one morning and said she couldn't stay in a town that had already forgotten her. She was in love with Thomas Averill," Jessica said softly. Mildred's eyes, so steady a moment ago, glistened. Yes, and he loved her, or at least he believed he did, until the weight of his name became more important than the truth they shared. Jessica waited, sensing the rest was coming. "She was pregnant when she left," Mildred continued. "They both thought it was impossible. Eleanor had been told she couldn't conceive. But then, well, life has its own quiet surprises." Jessica leaned forward gently. "Did the child survive?" Mildred hesitated. "I was told he didn't, but I never saw a funeral, never saw Eleanor afterward. She stopped writing, stopped calling. I think someone made sure her story ended before it became too inconvenient." There was no anger in Mildred's voice, only sadness. A long quiet mourning that had never been named. Jessica glanced toward the mantel, There, beside a faded photo of two young girls, was a third frame turned face down. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Some grief is too sacred to explain. As Jessica stood to leave, her gaze drifted once more to the photograph shelf. She paused. "May I?" Mildred hesitated only a moment before nodding. Jessica lifted the small wooden frame and gently turned it over. It was a family photo taken sometime in the early 80s. Mildred, unmistakably younger, stood beside Eleanor, and in Eleanor's arms was a small child, his face all but erased by careful scratching. Jessica's breath caught. It was precise, not vandalism, but removal, done with intention. She looked to Mildred, whose lips pressed together with a kind of quiet resignation. She said it was better not to remember what could never be claimed. "But someone else has been erasing her," Jessica said softly. "From photos, from records, from memory." Mildred's voice trembled for the first time, because she mattered, and that frightened them. Jessica nodded slowly, her heart heavy with a recognition she'd known all too often. When history was inconvenient, people didn't destroy it. They buried it in plain sight. And in Maplebridge, Eleanor Pruitt was the town's deepest unmarked grave. Jessica found Julian Fiske at his rented cottage on the edge of Maplebridge, a modest place cluttered with manuscripts and the quiet scent of ink and pipe smoke. He was a man in his 60s, with a face that once might have belonged to a scholar, but now bore the lines of too many compromises. He answered the door with a start. "Mrs. Fletcher, this is unexpected. I was hoping we might talk," Jessica said kindly, "about Thomas and Daniel Reese." Julian hesitated, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The sitting room was cramped, papers stacked in leaning towers on every available surface. Jessica carefully navigated between them as Julian poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. "I know Daniel came to see you," she said gently. Julian let out a long breath. "Yes, he asked difficult questions, wanted to know about the unpublished memoir, about changes made after Thomas's passing." "Changes?" Jessica prompted. Julian nodded. Thomas included passages about someone named Eleanor, deeply personal writing. Nothing scandalous in tone, but revealing, and Daniel thought those passages should remain intact. "Were they removed?" Julian glanced away, at Margaret's request. "Years ago, she didn't want shadows in the margins of Thomas's legacy." Jessica watched his hands fidget with a coaster. "And did Rebecca know about these edits?" He hesitated again. "I don't believe she did. Not at first, but now." Jessica felt the threads tightening. Daniel had been circling something fragile, something that didn't want to be seen. And Julian, for all his quiet guilt, was the kind of man who followed orders, not one who struck out in fear. Still, she thought, guilt leaves a stain even when no crime is committed. That night, a call from Sheriff Duvall roused Jessica from her notebook. "There's been a break-in," the sheriff said curtly, "at the library, the Averill collection." Jessica arrived shortly after, coat wrapped tight against the chill. The main room was dimly lit, the door to the special collections room ajar. Sylvie Maris stood nearby, pale and tight-lipped. "They didn't take anything," she said quickly, but the filing drawers were rifled through. The box with Thomas's original journals, someone tried to pry it open. Jessica stepped closer. The box's lock had been scratched, not destroyed, but tested. Whoever it was had known exactly what they were looking for. "Nothing was stolen?" she asked. "Not that I can tell," Sylvie replied, but Jessica felt it, that hum in the air when someone has tried to erase not just facts but history. The journals had remained for now, but someone was growing more desperate. Jessica waited until Sylvie had calmed, then led her gently to one of the reading tables. The room, though disheveled, held its usual stillness. Books absorb panic differently than people. They remain patient. "Who asked you to edit Eleanor's name out of the town records?" Jessica asked softly. Sylvie looked at her hands, then at the cracked glass on the journal case. "It wasn't my decision," she said, almost in a whisper. "I was asked by Margaret Averill." Sylvie nodded once, the motion small and burdened. She said Eleanor had been a distraction, that Thomas's work would be misunderstood if her name was tied to it, and when he passed, there was talk about the letters, the poems. She said it would be best to clean the history before anyone started digging. "And Daniel?" Jessica asked. "He was the one doing the digging. I think he was closer to the truth than any of us realized." Jessica studied the woman's worn expression, the guilt and fatigue drawn in quiet lines. History, she thought, wasn't always erased with malice. Sometimes it was smudged out of fear of loss, of shame, of stories that didn't fit the town's idea of itself. But those erased stories often left traces behind, and Jessica was learning to read them all. The garden was quiet again, though the shadows seemed deeper than Jessica remembered. Morning mist curled at the edges of the low stone walls, and the autumn leaves, scattered in uneven clusters, gave the grounds a hush that felt almost reverent. Jessica walked the narrow path toward the broken sundial, the one that had marked both time and death. It stood crooked now, its crack still visible at the base, a wound that no caretaker had dared to mend. She crouched beside it, tracing her fingers along the worn marble. The impact had left a jagged impression along the side, but something beneath the dial's pedestal caught her attention. A faint line of engraving, obscured by dirt and shadow. She brushed it clean with the edge of her scarf. "To E, where time began and ended." She stared at the words, her breath softening. There it was, buried under decades and ivy, a dedication that could only have come from Thomas Averill. No initials, no flourish, just that single letter. Jessica straightened, her mind turning the phrase like a key in a lock. It wasn't simply romantic, it was final, a full circle. Time had begun here, with a love affair, perhaps a child, and it had ended here too with a death. But what still lay between those 2 points? She glanced at the surrounding wall, her eyes narrowing. The stonework near the sundial had shifted, only slightly, but enough to suggest disturbance. Weather alone wouldn't cause such asymmetry. There was something in that wall, something Thomas had hidden, and someone else might have been looking for it too. Later that day, Jessica returned with Rebecca. The younger woman's expression was guarded, but willing. She followed Jessica to the sundial without question. "Here," Jessica gestured. "Look at the wall, see how that stone juts forward. I believe it was meant to come loose." Rebecca hesitated. "Are you saying my father buried something here?" "I think he did," Jessica replied gently, "not just metaphorically." They worked together, hands chilled by the stone, until Rebecca's fingers slipped behind a loosened mortar line. She paused, then slowly pulled a small metal box from the hollowed space. It was old, the latch slightly rusted, the edges damp from years of concealment. Rebecca looked at it as though it might burn her. "May I?" Jessica asked. Rebecca nodded. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with a silk ribbon, were a handful of items, a small bundle of handwritten poems in an unfamiliar hand, elegant and aching with emotion, a locket, its chain tarnished, and beneath them, folded with surgical precision, a document that made Rebecca's breath catch. A birth certificate. Jessica read it silently. Michael Pruitt Averill, born August 3, 1980, mother, Eleanor Pruitt, father Thomas Averill. Rebecca stepped back, one hand to her mouth. "He never told me." "I don't believe he told anyone," Jessica said softly. But Daniel must have found clues, and if he did, he might have understood what this meant, not just for your father's legacy, but for you. Rebecca's eyes filled, but her voice was level. If people knew Thomas had a son, it would change everything. Jessica closed the box with quiet reverence. Yes, but perhaps not ruin it, only reveal it. The garden seemed to still around them, as if listening. For decades the truth had slept inside a wall. Now, unearthed, it was beginning to breathe again. And Jessica knew this was no longer a question of legacy. It was a matter of identity. Jessica stood for a long time in the garden after Rebecca had gone inside, the weight of the box still present in her hands, though she no longer held it. Michael Pruitt Averill. A name hidden in stone, wrapped in oilcloth, forgotten by history, but never entirely erased. Daniel must have stumbled upon a clue, not the box perhaps, but something, a line in a poem, a journal entry, or the torn letter now burned into Jessica's thoughts. Something that led him to begin asking questions about the poet's legacy, and ultimately about who might have a legal or moral claim to it. The discovery of a child, Thomas Averill's child, wouldn't merely complicate his literary reputation. It would threaten inheritance, alter public memory, and destabilize the very foundation of the Averill family's place in Maplebridge. Jessica's instincts whispered that Daniel, gentle though he was, had not been silenced by accident. His search had become a danger to someone, and the child he was trying to find, if he still lived, might not even know what storm surrounded his name, but someone else did. Jessica met Sheriff Clara Duval at the town records office just past noon the following day. The air was thick with late autumn damp, and Jessica carried with her a quiet resolve. She'd spent the morning comparing timelines, addresses, and hospital reports that Rebecca had unearthed from the Averill family archive. Clara greeted her with the kind of wary respect Jessica had come to expect from seasoned law officers, those who had learned that deduction often traveled quieter roads than sirens. "There's a sealed adoption file from 1980, Clara said as they walked into the small back room where the town clerk kept confidential materials. Sealed at the request of the birth mother. The name listed for the child is Michael. The surname is omitted." Jessica nodded. "And the adopting family?" "Edward and Marlene Brooks," Clara replied. "Both passed away some years ago. They owned the greenhouse on Elm." Jessica's gaze sharpened. "Then that would be Evan Brooks." "The florist," Clara tilted her head. "Quiet guy, keeps to himself. Known for his arrangements more than his words." It all aligned with what Jessica had already sensed. Evan Brooks fit the profile, adopted in the correct year, raised in the same town, and if the records were accurate, unaware of any connection to Thomas Averill. But coincidences, Jessica knew, were rarely just that. "Let's speak to him," she said softly. "Not to accuse, but to understand." Evan Brooks met them at the back of his modest shop, among trays of freshly cut lilies and bundles of thyme drying above the window. He was in his early 40s, lean and gentle-eyed, with a quiet air that reminded Jessica of wind through a church garden, present but never pushing. When Clara explained the reason for their visit, Evan blinked, visibly stunned. "Michael Averill," he repeated. "No, that's not me. My parents were Ed and Marlene Brooks. They never told me anything about an adoption." Clara exchanged a glance with Jessica but said nothing. "I mean, I always knew something didn't quite add up," Evan continued slowly. "I never looked like either of them. But they loved me. I never questioned it." Jessica studied his face, his posture, the tremble of his hands. There was no guile there, no evasion. If Evan knew, it was news to him now. "What about Daniel Reese?" she asked gently. "You two spoke recently, didn't you?" Evan nodded. "He asked if we might be related, said he found something curious in the archives and wanted to talk more. He said it was important, but I didn't think." He trailed off, voice thickening with confusion. Jessica believed him, which only raised the next, more troubling question. Who else knew? Back in the garden, Jessica walked slowly along the path once more, letting her thoughts gather like dew along hedgerows. Evan hadn't known. Of that she was certain, which meant Daniel had been close enough to discover the truth, perhaps even ready to share it, but hadn't lived to do so. And if the child of Thomas and Eleanor had no idea who he truly was, then someone else must have. Someone who feared what the revelation would mean. The Averill name, carefully cultivated and preserved, was more than lineage. It was identity, wealth, prestige, belonging. The appearance of a new heir could upend not only inheritance, but the myth itself. Jessica thought of Julian Fiskey's hesitation, of Sylvie Maris's quiet compliance, of Margaret Averill's insistence that history be cleaned, and then she thought of Rebecca, a daughter raised in the shadow of a celebrated man, a girl told she was the only one, the custodian of memory. What would it mean for her future, if she were no longer the rightful heir? Jessica's heart grew heavy. Fear, she knew, came in many forms, and the most dangerous of all was fear dressed as love. Jessica sat alone in the Averill study once more, the late afternoon light slanting across the carpet in pale streaks. On the desk before her lay the two halves of the letter, one she had found behind Thomas's books, the other discovered in Daniel Reese's pocket. She placed them side by side. The torn edges matched perfectly, as though time itself had merely paused the message until she could make it whole. Her eyes moved across the page with familiar care. She knew the shape of grief in writing, the cadence of memory. But what struck her now was something she'd missed before, a final line, partly obscured when she had first read it in isolation. It read, "And if our son ever finds you, promise me he'll know love, not shame. Let him know that we tried, that we hoped, that even silence was a form of protection." Jessica exhaled, long and slow. It was a mother's plea, not for recognition, but for mercy, and it told her everything she needed to know about Eleanor's decision to disappear, and everything Daniel might have come to understand just before he died. She folded the letter gently, but her thoughts raced. This wasn't just about legacy or scandal. This was about a child, now a grown man, whose very existence had been denied, not out of hatred, but out of fear. A fear that had calcified into secrecy. Jessica rose slowly, her gaze lingering on the bookshelves, the untouched drafts, the memorial photo of Thomas on the mantel. He had loved Eleanor, of that she was now certain. But he had also left her, and their son, outside the story the world was allowed to read. And that omission, however poetic, had left someone desperate enough to kill for the silence it preserved. Later that evening, Jessica walked the length of the Averill garden once again, the leaves brittle beneath her feet. The box with the birth certificate was now with Sheriff Duval, sealed once more for safekeeping. But the truth could not be resealed as easily. Rebecca had not spoken much since the discovery. She had withdrawn into a quiet that felt less like grief and more like bracing for collapse. Jessica understood the weight. The child in the stone wall, so to speak, threatened more than memory. He threatened the carefully curated identity Rebecca had lived under all her life. The only child of a great man, the steward of his work, the heir to everything he'd left behind, his name, his house, his reputation. If Michael Evan was acknowledged, that would mean legal complications, yes, but something far more emotional, a reshaping of history, a fracture in the story that Thomas Averill had told the world and that Rebecca had repeated for decades. And Daniel? He had likely known what this would mean. He had tried to speak gently, perhaps even protectively. But he had underestimated what it feels like when a foundation begins to shake. Jessica paused near the sundial once more, its inscription catching the light. To EA, where time began and ended. He had known what it meant to love, but love, she thought, does not always excuse omission. And sometimes, the truth comes back with a name and a face that can no longer be ignored. Julian Fiske answered his door with the weariness of a man who knew the visit had been coming. Jessica stepped into the dim hallway, her tone gentle but unwavering. "I need to ask you again about the memoir and the edits." Julian led her to the sitting room, a narrow space crowded with bookspines and ashtrays. The fireplace had gone cold, and so had Julian's manner. "I already told you," he began, Margaret insisted. Jessica held his gaze. "Did Rebecca?" He looked away. "Eventually, she found an early draft, one I hadn't meant for her to see. She was upset." Jessica sat opposite him, the folded letter now resting in her lap. She didn't need to show it to him, he knew what it said. But she unfolded it anyway, and laid it on the coffee table between them. He stared at it as if it might burn the furniture. "I told her the truth could ruin everything," he said quietly. "That it would change how people remembered her father, that it would change her. But she pressed you to remove Eleanor's name." Julian nodded, "Not publicly. She was careful, but she asked me if we could downplay things. If the reference to a lost love could be made more abstract. If the birth Michael could be left out entirely." Jessica studied him in silence. "And you agreed?" "I owed Thomas," Julian said, though the conviction in his voice had thinned. "He gave me my first break. He trusted me, and then I owed her." Rebecca was trying to hold everything together. Jessica leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Did you know what Daniel had found?" Julian hesitated. "I suspected. He came to me with questions, said he had something that could shift the narrative. And I told him to leave it alone." Jessica stood. "Did you kill him, Julian?" His voice cracked. "No." She believed him, but belief was only part of the equation. The question that remained, who had the most to lose if Daniel spoke, and how far would they go to keep him silent? Evening settled like a hush over the Averill house. The windows glowed faintly against the darkening sky, and a wind stirred through the garden, sending dried leaves skipping across the stone path. Jessica moved quietly down the hallway, her thoughts anchored in the revelations Julian had shared. They did not surprise her, but they saddened her. She paused at the door to the study, where Rebecca sat by the fireplace, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the side table beside her. The flickering light caught her face in profile, her expression drawn, remote, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Jessica entered without a word and sat in the opposite chair. Silence stretched between them, thick with what had yet to be said. "I saw Julian," Jessica began softly. "He told me about the edits, and the pressure to protect your father's image." Rebecca didn't move. Jessica continued, her voice calm. "He told me you knew about the memoir, and about Michael." A tremor passed through Rebecca's shoulders, but she remained still. "I found the letter," Jessica said gently. "The whole of it, and the birth certificate. You've known for some time now, haven't you?" Rebecca's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers tightening around the armrest. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "I found the letter weeks ago. It had slipped behind one of the books in the study. At first, I thought it was a draft of something, a poem maybe. But then I saw her name, Eleanor, and the way he wrote about her." She trailed off, her jaw clenched. Jessica waited. "I wasn't angry," Rebecca said after a moment. Not at first, just hollow, like something inside me had suddenly been replaced. All my life, I believed I was his only child, the daughter who inherited his gift, his name, his home. I built everything around that, and then Daniel began asking questions. Jessica prompted gently. Rebecca's nod was slow, mechanical. He was gentle about it, careful, but I saw the way he looked at the letter. It scared me, not just because of what he might tell people, but because of what it meant. If Michael, Evan, if he was real, then everything I believed about my place in this world changed. She looked up at Jessica then, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. I didn't plan it. I swear, that night we were supposed to have dinner. He stopped by the garden to show me something. He said he'd found more proof, something in the town records. I told him to let it go, that some things didn't need to be unburied. Her voice shook now. He wouldn't. He said it wasn't about legacy, it was about truth. And then he reached into his coat and pulled out the torn half of the letter, said he was going to the sheriff if I didn't help him reveal it. Rebecca stared into the fire. I panicked. I saw the sundial behind him, and before I even realized what I was doing, I struck him, just once. He crumpled like he was made of paper. Jessica closed her eyes, her heart aching. I didn't mean to kill him, Jessica, Rebecca whispered. I only wanted to stop him, just for a moment, just long enough to think. Jessica opened her eyes, meeting her gaze. I believe you. Rebecca let out a shaky breath, but her shoulders did not relax. I would give anything to take it back. Jessica didn't answer. Some griefs could not be reasoned with. And yet, in that moment it was not condemnation that filled the room, but understanding. Jessica remained seated, her voice quiet beneath the flicker of firelight. You loved your father deeply. Rebecca gave a broken nod. He was everything, my compass, my measure for how to live. And yet, Jessica said gently, he left you only part of the story. Rebecca covered her face with both hands, her voice muffled. He wanted to protect me. I know that. But in doing so, he built a truth too fragile to survive the real one. Jessica stood, walked slowly around the desk, and placed a comforting hand on Rebecca's shoulder. There are some stories we inherit, she said, and some we have to unearth on our own. Yours was both. Rebecca wept softly now, not the storm of guilt, but the quiet breaking of a dam too long held. I didn't want to lose him, Jessica, she whispered. But I think I already had. Jessica said nothing, allowing the moment to hold. Outside the wind shifted, brushing the ivy along the window pane like a memory stirring. Rebecca's sobs ebbed into silence, and she looked up, her expression worn but unmasked. What happens now? Jessica's hand remained steady on her shoulder. That's not for me to decide. But whatever comes, the truth has already begun its work. And in that room, where so many secrets had been written, buried and burned, a kind of honesty, long denied, had finally been spoken aloud. The morning after Rebecca's quiet confession was unnervingly still. Even the birds seemed hesitant to break the hush that blanketed Maplebridge. Jessica stood by the kitchen window of the Averill house, cradling a lukewarm cup of tea, as she watched the sheriff's cruiser slow to a stop along the garden path. Sheriff Duvall stepped out with a weight to his gait that hadn't been there the day before. He removed his hat as he entered the room where Rebecca waited, dressed in yesterday's blouse, her face pale but calm. Jessica remained at a respectful distance as he read her rights, not with force, but with something more solemn, acknowledgement. I understand, Rebecca said softly, her voice no longer strained by concealment. I won't resist. The sheriff nodded, but didn't move to take her arm. I've spoken to the district attorney already, he murmured. Given the confession, the lack of premeditation, and well, the circumstances, there may be room for leniency. But that's not my call to make. Jessica's eyes followed Rebecca as she stood. She carried herself with surprising composure, as though by finally telling the truth, she had found something steadier to stand upon than reputation. "She's not a danger to anyone," Jessica said quietly once they'd stepped outside. "No," Devol replied, gazing out toward the sundial in the garden. "But justice doesn't always have sharp edges. Sometimes it just needs to be heard." Jessica nodded. That morning, there would be no sirens, no neighbors gathering at fences, just a car driving away slowly from a house that had harbored too many unspoken things. She remained at the threshold long after they'd gone, the scent of ash and old paper still lingering faintly in the air. Somewhere in the parlor behind her, a draft stirred the edges of Thomas Averill's collected works, lying unopened on the table. The story, Jessica thought, had always been waiting to be rewritten by someone brave enough to admit that truth, no matter how bruised, still had its place among poetry. The florist shop on Ash Lane was a modest affair, tucked between the tailors and a faded antique store. Jessica arrived just as the closed for lunch sign was being flipped back to open. Evan Brooks looked up from behind a small arrangement of pale lilies, surprise flickering across his features. "I thought you'd be long gone by now," he said. Jessica smiled gently. "I thought perhaps I owed someone one last chapter." He motioned for her to sit by the window, clearing aside a few stems and wire cutters. The space smelled of damp leaves and floral preservative, with hints of jasmine tucked into the bouquet beside them. "I read the poems," Evan said after a moment. "The ones in the box." Her handwriting was beautiful. Precise, but it's not the neatness that got to me, it was the voice. Jessica listened, watching his face carefully. She wrote like someone who had been waiting to be remembered, and somehow I knew it was about me. Even before I saw the birth certificate. He chuckled, though it carried no mirth. "Turns out my life began in verse." Jessica placed a hand lightly over his. "Not began," she corrected softly. "Revealed," he nodded. "I keep thinking about all the little signs I missed, why I always felt drawn to old words, to Thomas's poetry. I used to read it at night in college, you know, never knowing." "Blood speaks in quiet ways," Jessica said. "It doesn't always need a name to leave its mark." Evan's eyes welled, but he blinked them clear. "And now what do I do with it?" Jessica's voice was firm though kind. "You live with it. You don't have to take his name. You don't have to claim the estate, but you get to claim your truth, and hers. That's something no legacy can take away." He sat back, letting the thought settle. In the distance, the town bell chimed the hour, and a few customers wandered in, bringing the scent of fresh air with them. Jessica rose. "Take your time, Evan. The world will still be here when you're ready to meet it again." He smiled faintly. "Thank you for not telling me what to be, just for listening." Jessica left quietly, the door's little bell marking her exit. Behind her, a son who had once arranged roses for others had begun, at last, to find the roots of his own story. Later that afternoon, Jessica found herself once again walking the familiar stone path behind the Averill home. The garden looked different now, not in its physical form but in its atmosphere. The shadows were still there, of course, stretching from hedge to fence, but they no longer felt watchful. Evan was kneeling by a row of struggling hydrangeas, fingers sunk gently into the soil. A leather-bound notebook lay beside him. Thomas's, judging by the faded initials on the cover. He glanced up and smiled. "I figured someone should tend to this place." Jessica knelt beside him, her skirt brushing the mulch. "It's good soil," Evan said, scooping a handful. "Tired but alive." Jessica looked around. The sundial still stood, now scrubbed of the blood it had once borne. A new engraving had been added beneath the original. To remember is to forgive. It wasn't my idea, Evan said, noticing her gaze. Rebecca suggested it, before she left. Jessica let the silence speak for them a moment. You know, Evan added, people keep asking if I'll stay in Maplebridge, and I don't have an answer yet. But this garden, it doesn't feel foreign anymore. It feels like someone once loved here, and maybe that's enough. Jessica smiled, a deep, quiet warmth rising in her chest. It's more than enough, she said. It's a beginning. They tended the soil together in silence while above them the wind moved through the branches with something that sounded almost like peace. Back in her room at the Maplebridge Inn, Jessica sat at the small oak writing desk, its surface scratched by time and use. The innkeeper had left a teapot and a plate of shortbread beside her, now gone cold, untouched. Outside the window, the branches of a maple tree swayed gently, casting shifting shadows on the lace curtains. She dipped her pen in the ink well, a habit she had returned to, out of respect, she thought, for the tone of this place. Her journal lay open, its cream-colored pages half-filled. She hesitated for a long moment, then began, "There is something uniquely haunting about towns that hide their stories behind stone and silence. Maplebridge, so picturesque to the passing eye, kept one such story buried in its garden walls, its edited records, and its broken-hearted daughters." She paused, listening to the ticking of the room's clock, then continued, "In the end, the tragedy here was not in the murder, as shocking as that was, but in the generations of denial that preceded it. A poet loved, a woman bore a child, and a family, fearing the upheaval of reputation, chose erasure over remembrance." Jessica's hand hovered over the page. She had seen her share of secrets in her life, and many, she had learned, were not born out of malice, but fear of loss, fear of scandal, fear of rewriting a story too carefully curated. Daniel Reese came too close to the truth. His death was not about money or inheritance, not truly. It was about a legacy desperately protected, a daughter who adored her father beyond reason, a publisher bound more by affection than ethics, and a hidden heir, unaware he was born from stanzas and sorrow. She thought of Evan, arranging roses with quiet care, and of Rebecca, her face pale with the burden of love turned misguided. Neither villain, not really, but both caught in the undertow of someone else's myth. Jessica wrote on. Justice was served, though not with loud verdicts or headlines. It came in the form of confession and remembrance, in the restoration of a name long deleted from the archives, and in the bloom of new petals over old soil. She gently closed the journal and laid her pen aside. The words were there now, not for the world to read, but for her to understand. There would always be stories, she thought, some shouted from rooftops, others whispered in gardens, beneath sundials, inside love letters torn and forgotten. It was not her place to judge which deserved preservation, only to listen carefully, and record what might otherwise vanish like smoke. Jessica stood by the window as twilight settled like a soft shawl over Maplebridge. The garden behind the inn glowed in fading amber hues, and the last bird of the day cut silent arcs across the sky. She sipped her now reheated tea, content to let the silence breathe. This, she had always believed, was the truest conclusion to a story, not the dramatic arrest or the courtroom sentence, but the hush that followed understanding, the moment when grief, truth, and memory all settled into their rightful places. She thought again of Rebecca, awaiting her next steps with quiet dignity, and of Evan, who would carry forward not a legacy of scandal, but a truth gentled by poetry. She had seen him earlier that afternoon, slipping a small hand-tied bouquet onto Eleanor Pruitt's modest grave, not as an obligation, but as a son's wordless offering. The town, too, would change, albeit slowly. Sylvie Maris had already hinted she would revise the town's historical records to include Eleanor by name. "About time we gave her back her ink," she had said. Jessica had nodded, feeling the poetry in the gesture. A breeze stirred through the crack in the window frame. Jessica leaned her hand against the sill, watching a lantern flicker to life at the edge of the street below. So many lives had intersected in this small town, through accidents, through letters, through old photographs and shadows on stone. She thought again of the phrase engraved beneath the sundial, "To remember is to forgive." She breathed it in, letting the final shape of the story settle in her mind. It would not be one of sensationalism, nor of villainy. It was a story of consequences, of love misdirected, of silence too long endured. She would not write about it for publication. Some stories, she believed, were better left to those who had lived them. Jessica turned from the window, letting the curtains fall gently into place. The day was done, and with it, the burden of unraveling someone else's history. But somewhere, she felt certain, a garden was beginning again, and that perhaps was enough. Some truths come softly, like dusk over a quiet garden, unfolding, not with thunder, but with the gentle weight of memory finally spoken aloud. But I wonder, when a secret is kept out of love, and revealed through loss, was it ever truly a lie, or just a different kind of devotion? What do you think? Share your thoughts or theories in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And if this mystery spoke to you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who enjoys a quiet unraveling, and subscribe for more stories where shadows linger just beneath the words.